This is the Detroit Sports Podcast Network.
The biggest icon in podcasting.
Welcome in, everybody, to this week's edition of Doc and Jock. I am the Doc, John Macaroon, survived the 2023 NFL Draft. Whew, a lot to break down regarding the Detroit Lions. It was literally a roller coaster of emotions. Day one, it appeared as if the world was on fire for the Detroit Lions. Everybody was discussing and debating feverishly what the Detroit Lions accomplished on day one. Day two and day three, little bit calmer from the masses. It was just a wild ride, top to bottom. General Manager Brad Holmes did say this was going to be a very unpredictable NFL draft, and that's how it shook out, where you have the Texans moving up to get pick number 3, and they got 2 and 3 in the first round. Balls by Nick Cesario. And you realize, wow, it just set the table for what was going to happen. And we're going to break it all down with my guy, Adam, the Jock Strozinski. The Detroit Lions general manager Brad Holmes then decided that, okay, I'm going to light up the phone lines. I'm going to call, trade up for Brian Branch, trade down here, add more picks here. It literally was an extreme roller coaster trying to cover it. Giving up 3 picks for a defensive tackle. It was just wild. Then you trade DeAndre Swift on top of it. So much to break down. And it was just a wild ride being there, trying to cover it all, putting out over 35 articles, podcasts, tweets. It was just an extreme roller coaster. Finally, 5 days later, starting to feel normal again. And I'm glad that I have an opportunity to bounce ideas off of my guy, Adam, the Jock Strozinski. Let me set the table here. Adam was definitely intrigued by what happened in the first round. So much so that he was just like, I need to gather myself. I just can't talk about this right this very second. And I'm fascinated, guys. Buckle up, because I think Adam is going to share what a lot of people felt regarding some decisions that were made, but we're going to have a healthy debate. Because what's happening? What's going on? Are you settled in, ready to talk about the Detroit Lions draft and what the hell they tried to accomplish?
Yeah, I mean, I think let's just start right there. Let me set the stage for you, okay? Because I'm taking the draft in. I'm excited. I planned my entire Thursday around the first round of the NFL draft. Everything planned around it. From the time I got out of work, to the time I got home, time I played with my dogs, to the time I made dinner, to the time I showered. Everything planned around being butt in the seat at 7:55, ready to take it all in. And I'm watching, and I'm anticipating. And you start to see how these first picks go. Bryce Young, no big surprise, right? CJ Stroud, like, okay, makes sense. Next thing you know, you have the trade with Houston moving up to grab Will Anderson. And you're like, all right, well, that kind of sucks. That was the guy we wanted. And then Anthony Richardson goes at 4. Again, not really a surprise. Now you're like, okay, what is Seattle going to do? And you're in your head, you're like, they're definitely taking Jalen Carter, right? Definitely taking Jalen Carter. No, they take the guy that the Lions originally wanted in Devin Witherspoon. They grab him. So now you're like, all right, well, what's Detroit going to do? And across the ticker, it pops in because you're like, well, they're not taking Jalen Carter, are they? Like, they have a chance to take Jalen Carter, but they're not going to. Is it Tyree Wilson? You're like, Tyree Wilson's got a bit of a foot injury. So what the hell is going to happen here? And you're just kind of waiting. Pops across the screen. Trade is in. Oh. And you're like, fuck yeah, let's go. To the highest of the highs, right? Super excited because they traded back. That was something that we talked about. If your guy wasn't there, can you trade back? These guys traded back. And it wasn't like they traded back so far that it was unrealistic. They traded back to 12. And you're like, this is perfect. They're kind of in that, right around that top 10 range. There's already been some guys that have not gone and some talents that have kind of gone a little bit before I think we maybe thought they might have. So like this works out well for everybody. Like they're still in a really good spot. All right, let's go. And then Pete Skoronski goes at 11 and Lions are on the clock. And then the pick is in. And it's Jahmyr Gibbs. And I just laughed hysterically to myself. I laughed hysterically to myself. I was like, the one thing that we talked about on this very podcast, and the one thing that you and I have debated about with that first pick, you don't take a running back. You don't take a running back. These guys took a running back. I was running around my house screaming. I was like, you don't take a running back this early in the draft. You just don't do it. I messaged you. I messaged Kenny. We had a nice little group message going on. There were a lot of expletives, and it was the same F word that was repeated over and over and over for me. And I was just so upset and so angry. And I was like, look, they have a chance to redeem themselves with 18. So you just kind of let the draft kind of continue out. And honestly, between picks 13 and 17, I was kind of like, I think I told you at one point, I was like, I'm going to bed. I got to get up early in the morning. I'm checking out. I was just kind of over it. They end up taking Jack Campbell. And again, I was like, did he go a little bit too soon? Like, this is a guy that I think we all thought we could get with that 34th pick that they traded back and picked up from Arizona. Like, did he go a little too soon? Could they have gotten him a little bit later? And wouldn't it have made a little bit more sense if they got him in the second round? Like, what is going on here? So I ended up having my freak out. I was very upset. And then I came back the next day. And I was like, just let it settle in. The draft is not one day. The draft is 3 days in a row.
Correct.
Plus, it's whoever they sign as an undrafted free agent. So there's still more work to be done. And that's how I had to talk to myself about it, right? That's how I had to basically work through all of this. And as you kind of get through the draft, you get into round two, and you're like, all right, cool. I like that pick. It's a solid pick. That's good. I watched all of round two and was pleasantly surprised. And there were moments in this draft, though, where you have to question what Brad Holmes was thinking, right? You have to question what he was doing. And I think if you take the long view approach, right, the 1,000-foot glance at what he did, you see that this guy had targeted certain players. There were guys that he had an extremely high grade on. And he was like, these are our guys. These are the guys we're going to go get. And it doesn't necessarily matter what I have to give up. In this case, talking about that third-round defensive tackle that you mentioned. It doesn't matter what I have to give up. It doesn't matter where I'm taking them. These are guys that I have targeted, and these are guys that are very high on my board, so I'm going to go get them. And that's what he did. So what this draft tells you is Brad Holmes believes in these guys. These are the guys that Brad Holmes handpicked to go to war with. He believes these guys are going to give this team a fighting chance to make the playoffs. And we will have to wait and see. I think this draft was a little bit head-scratching. When you look back at the totality of his other drafts, this is a little bit of a head-scratcher because of where he took some of these guys. But if you look at the draft as a whole, I think it's easier to digest, right? If you just go day one, the reactions were out of this world. Everybody was ready to go to Allen Park with pitchforks and burn it down. Day two comes around, everybody softens a little bit. Day three rolls around, everybody's like, all right, I get what he was kind of doing. And honestly, nationally, this draft is getting praised. This draft is one of the better drafts. I mean, I don't think it was nearly as good as what the Eagles and the Seahawks did. I think it was a pretty good draft, but I don't think it was anywhere near the realm that those guys had. But it definitely wasn't a bad draft either. So this was one of those drafts where I think it's a little bit polarizing. I think this draft right here will kind of tell you how Brad Holmes is going to do in the city of Detroit, because this one has fans lining up on both sides of the aisle. And look, you either really like it or you really don't. Doesn't really feel like there's a whole lot of middle ground here.
Yeah, it's crazy the way in which it swung. And it's just really wild to see in the aftermath the debates about positional value, about did the Lions reach for players, the Patriots and Giants and Jets potentially taking Gibbs, the idea of maybe what the Lions could have done. So it's a fascinating look at a draft and a philosophy that now you can debate. What Brad Holmes did, and it's very much something that you and I would have to respect, is he came out and said that, look, despite maybe better players being available that the Lions could have taken, a la Jalen Carter, a la maybe another defensive back, he said that we are targeting players that we love that also help out where we're looking for. And it opens up Brad Holmes to now put his reputation and his evaluation with his team out there on the table. And it's very fair because there is a realistic a chance here that Jalen Carter has a successful career with the Eagles. I mean, they literally have surrounded him with his former teammates. They have put a team, it's a wild strategy that the Eagles have deployed to draft the 2021 the 2021 Georgia Bulldogs defense. So you recognize, and this is the debate that we've always had here in Detroit, and it's either going to be very wildly successful and set this team up, or it's going to eventually end up costing Brad Holmes and that team his job. Because in essence, he has put out there that fits for us, best player available, maybe is not exactly what we're looking for. We're looking for best fit available for our scheme. And that's the position you get, and that's the opportunity that you are afforded when you start drafting two classes that have put together some needs on defense when you go out in free agency and you get a cornerback. So Jahmyr Gibbs is a luxury pick, but in this offense, you don't think a home run threat that you can put in the slot and line up at multiple spots. Basically, you got the guy that you felt best fits your offense. It's not Bijan Robinson, who I wanted and clamored for, but how can I then turn around and say a guy from the SEC with elite speed and talent and is a weapon is the wrong choice? They evaluated him. They feel like he's the right guy. He's from the SEC at Alabama. All signs for me, all is good. Now, yes, I will entertain the debate about positional value and what that means, but I do believe that Jack Campbell and Jahmyr Gibbs helped this football team win. And so that's all you're looking for. Impact for the next 4 or 5 years. Potential captain on defense, potential home run threat on offense that maybe will stay healthier than the guy before. You use the guy before to gain additional capital. It's a win-win all the way around. I don't see as much of a bust factor with Jahmyr Gibbs as maybe others do. And for the Lions, I feel like it's a great pick. But at the same time, I'm definitely curious to see how Jalen Carter does, because you did have a need in the interior of the defensive line, and the guy that you did take, maybe you overpaid for, and potentially doesn't have exactly the skill set that you're looking for. But what he does bring to the table in Broderick Martin is something to talk about, a big, huge defensive tackle that should be able to clog the middle. So for me, I graded it a B. I don't think it's an A-plus draft, but I think for where the Lions are at, this is a draft that gets you to the playoffs and puts you in a position to win. So you get Brian Branch, the steal of the draft. You potentially have a wide receiver that can stretch the field a little bit if he develops, and you're looking at an offensive lineman that's going to be a depth piece. So by and large, the 8 picks I think are solid, not too crazy. I think in totality, the draft helps the team. Because is there a player? Is it Jalen Carter that you realize he's not on the board? Do you think that maybe the Lions should have just stayed at 6? If they were to make a different kind of move here, would they have taken Jalen Carter at number 6? Would they have taken just Bijan Robinson at number 6? Is there moves made that you now see in hindsight that would have been better for the Lions now that you've had a time to reflect on it?
So let's start with Bijan Robinson. I don't think they had the opportunity to take Bijan if they wanted to. They did not. I think that they had Jahmyr Gibbs ahead of Bijan Robinson, and they liked what he could do. Like Jahmyr Gibbs is going to essentially be your Alvin Kamara. He is going to be a player. He's going to be a guy who is on the field when David Montgomery's on the field. He's a guy who's going to be on the field lining up with the wide receivers. He's a guy who's going to be on the field lining up in the backfield. I could see them design a play where he lines up along the line and looks like he's a tight end. I could see them coming up with something like that because their offense is so inventive and so creative. They felt like what he brought, the things that he did really, really well, those intangibles were better than what Bijan Robinson did. So I don't think Bijan Robinson was ever necessarily on the board. I think it was always Jahmyr Gibbs over Bijan Robinson. Now, you look at other guys that they could have possibly taken, whether it be a Jalen Carter. I know that we've talked about upgrading the offensive line, so whether Pete Skoronski or Darnell Wright. We've also talked a little bit about Lucas Van Ness possibly being there. There were a couple of other guys, cornerbacks like Christian Gonzalez, or even possibly taking a wide receiver. I think we both felt like a wide receiver at that point was a little bit too high for this team. But that was another guy who was on the table, another position that was on the table. I feel like whatever happened in that meeting with Jalen Carter, it told the Lions everything they needed to know. Jalen Carter was never a viable option for this team here. And when I was watching the pre-show of the draft, I don't remember if I had ESPN on or if I had NFL Network on, but somebody made a really salient point, and I think it kind of goes to show what ended up happening specifically with Jalen Carter. And I do think that there may be a point where this team does regret not drafting Jalen Carter, but Jalen Carter was never on their list. And one of the analysts said he's not the alpha, he's a beta. He is a guy who is going to be second. He is a guy who needs to be led. He is not a natural leader. He's a guy who needs to go and basically play next to a guy like Jordan Davis, which is exactly what's basically going to happen here, right? Yeah, the Eagles end up selecting Jordan Davis, or was that the Jets that took them? I don't remember. But anyways, he needs to essentially be surrounded by leaders. And if you look at what happened when he was at Georgia, he was essentially surrounded by a really good leadership council that helped keep him in line. When he started to go a little bit astray, some of that leadership wasn't there. He needs to be a guy that has to slot in behind somebody else. He is not the number one. He is not an alpha. The Lions are looking for alphas. The Lions want number one guys. They want leaders. Jalen Carter was never going to be that guy. Jalen Carter is not that guy. He was never an option for the Detroit Lions. I find it funny, though, that a team like the Chicago Bears, that was another team that we thought that Jalen Carter might go to. The Bears were willing to move back one spot and allow the Eagles to move up to grab Jalen Carter and say, go ahead, take him. So it really kind of goes to show you, Jalen Carter, as impactful as he might be on the field and as good of a player as he can be, he really needs to be in the right situation. So much so that you had a bunch of teams pass on him. You had Arizona pass on him. Not once, but twice. You had Atlanta pass on him. You had Las Vegas pass on him. You had the Bears pass on him. And, of course, you had the Lions pass on him. Everybody said, nah, we're good. And, obviously, there were teams that were open for business as far as trading goes. So if you really want to get granular with it, 31 other teams passed on him, essentially. Like, nobody moved up to grab this guy. Nobody said, we're going to go take him. And obviously, the Detroit Lions were open for business. The Chicago Bears at 9 were open for business. At 7 and 8, I would assume that the Raiders and the Falcons were also open for business, and nobody jumped up to grab him. So, again, he's a guy who I think has to go to a very specific situation where your leadership is incredibly strong, and he is almost forced to stay in line. Like, you can't get out of line. And here in Detroit, it just wasn't going to work that way. Does it suck? Yeah, I think so. Because I think the one thing coming out of this draft is that Brad Holmes really believes in his defensive front more than I think anybody here in Detroit does. I found it very, very shocking that he waited so long to address the need up front. I kept waiting for him to take a big guy, whether it be an edge rusher, whether it be a D tackle. Look, I love the pick of Jack Campbell. I thought you could have maybe done it a little bit later in this draft. But look, I love the pick of Jack Campbell. I think it's great. I think he's going to help this defense immensely. All that being said, I wanted to see a defensive tackle taken. I wanted to see an edge rusher taken. I wanted to see some help along that defensive front. And you really didn't get that until the third round and late in the third round. And then you had to give up stuff to move up to get that pick. And that was a little bit head scratching to me. That was a little bit like, hey, wait, what's going on here? You like, if you really felt like the defensive line was that much of a concern, you had Jalen Carter sitting right there. You could have just took him. Obviously, they didn't feel strong about him. Again, I believe he's a player who needs to be drafted into the right situation, and everything kind of has to be right for him in order for him to succeed and produce at his very best. And I think the Eagles are a good spot for him. I think the Eagles crushed this draft. I think the Eagles had a really, really nice draft. All that being said, I do think Detroit at some point may regret not taking him. And it may come as soon as this year because, again, he seems like he's going to be an impactful player along the defensive line. I feel like them addressing their defensive front as late as they did is a bit of an issue. And again, Brad Holmes has a different idea on how he wants to build that front. It's different than what I think, and it's probably different than what you think. Were you shocked that they didn't address the defensive line sooner? And do you think that this team's going to regret not drafting Jalen Carter specifically to help anchor that defensive tackle position?
I think when you look at Jalen Carter, if you're going to allocate first-round resources to anybody on your team and you have a question mark, I just don't think you can do it. I think, yes, you have the need on the defensive line, but you did have somebody on your board that you felt like is going to be somebody that could fit in and has the story that you're looking for, somebody that's motivated, somebody that comes from a lesser school that might have, not been heralded, but somebody that when you give him the opportunity to develop. Brett Holmes was asked in a radio interview, he said, look, we looked at the film of Broderick Martin, and we see a player that maybe doesn't have the best pad level, doesn't have the best fundamentals. Do you think you can work with them to help and improve some of the weaknesses? And Brett Holmes said, look, every player has warts. Every player has a weakness. We don't draft players that when we bring them in, we don't feel like can be coached up. So they understand what his weaknesses are, and they understand that he's a one-dimensional, big-bodied athlete that is not really all that athletic, not all that fast, but 330 pounds, long arms. Basically, they need his body there to clog the middle. They don't need him to pass rush. They got James Houston. They got Charles Harris. They got Romeo and Julian Aquara. They got Aiden Hutchinson. That's 5 solid pass rushers. They are looking for a big-bodied dude, obviously, that is going to work hard and come in and fit. And you also have Isaiah Buggs. You have Benito Jones. So there is depth there. They just went with a player that they felt fit the mold a little bit better. So I don't think they're going to regret it. I do think Jalen Carter.
I think right there, though, I think that tells you what you need to know about how this front office views players in the draft.
Yes.
Can they be coached up?
Yes.
I don't think Jalen Carter was a guy who necessarily took coaching well, or if he did take the coaching, I don't think he necessarily he ended up utilizing it and applying it. Correct. This is the one thing I can tell you. So this weekend, I missed the third round. I missed most of the third round, fourth through seventh round. I missed most of it. I was in a bowling tournament, and when I went to this bowling tournament, there was an older gentleman. Like he was way older. My man had like a back brace on and had like the whole hand thing going on. Anyways, he ended up changing up so much of my fundamentals. Right, I ended up having like one game where I just bowled like absolute dog shit. But he was trying to coach me, and he was trying to teach me. And everything he was trying to teach me, basically in the middle of this tournament, which is not the time to freaking do these things, I was taking and I was trying to apply. If you can't take coaching and you can't be coached up, Brad Holmes is telling you, we don't want you. We don't have a spot for you. So I think that's where Jalen Carter kind of falls. It's another one of those check marks that he didn't have on his report card. He's not coachable. He does not apply the coaching that he gets. And I think that's another thing that this front office took and basically used it when making the decision to whether or not to draft Jalen Carter.
Yeah, absolutely. I just don't think that. And look, the blessing is that many teams passed, so it gives you the opportunity to say, hey, look, if Seattle passed, that's a team that just doesn't mind taking players that have risks. They went safer. They went to a player that they felt was a little bit more in line with what they're looking for in Devin Witherspoon. And the Raiders, if the Raiders pass on you, that just indicates that, okay, there's a lot of concerns. And it goes to show you that there is a concern. And you can never really draft a first-round player and give him all that money if you don't believe he's going to work hard or fit your system. So I don't mind them passing. I think that Broderick Martin will do the job and handle the responsibilities that he's got to. So I'm hoping at least that based on history and the track record that Brad Holmes has targeted players that are going to fit. So were you surprised? I'm curious. The first round shook out very interestingly. A lot of, and I think going into the draft, it was talked about that really, if you fairly evaluated what a first-round player is, only maybe 12 to 13 players really, truly had a first-round grade. That's why you had so many trades, so many teams looking to move forward, look back. And I just think that the way in which the league viewed the draft was interesting in that they didn't really value the wide receiver position as much as maybe they usually do with the run starting in the 20s. So you look at that draft and you say, okay, some of the top-end players were quarterbacks. I wasn't surprised I wasn't surprised at all that Will Levis dropped. It's unfortunate for him because it's the ultimate league embarrassment when you're all dolled up and you're the last guy there and you're not selected. So it was very interesting. That was probably the surprise. I would have thought that maybe later on my projection would have been, 25 through 30, he might have been selected. But going to the Titans in the second round, not all that crazy. But I just felt like the draft really kind of in totality, the way in which you would summarize it is just a cluster of players that in years past wasn't as good as previous drafts.
Yeah, I found it really shocking because you and I both did a ton of mock drafts, right? And not only did we do a ton, we both read a ton. And normally we read a ton on here. And that's only a small sample size of what we actually digest. And where the mock drafts had a lot of these players, there was a ton of these guys that did not go in those spaces, specifically in the first and second and third round. I was shocked that a guy like Ivan Pace or Ivan Pierce, the linebacker out of, I think it was Cincinnati, he ended up going as an undrafted free agent. This was a guy who was supposed to be one of the top 5 linebackers in this draft class. And this is a guy who didn't even get drafted. So it just goes to tell you the grade that a lot of the pundits gave a lot of these guys. The teams didn't really see it as that much. And look, I think that this is going to be a really interesting draft to watch as far as historical stances go. Like we just had history happen with the 2020 draft where there were a bunch of players who didn't have their 5th-year options picked up. Jeff Okudah was one of them. Chase Young was another one of them. These are guys who we're all very familiar with, and their 5th-year options were picked up. And it just kind of goes to tell you that the teams don't necessarily value what they're bringing to the table right now. It's going to be interesting to see how this draft class ends up playing out in the future. And if a lot of these guys in 4 years aren't even in the league anymore, because I think it is a lot like you said, the way the teams I feel viewed these guys, there were a handful of guys who they felt were elite talents, handful of guys who they were like, yeah, these guys are straight up dogs and they deserve to get drafted in the first round. Then there were a bunch of just other guys, and those other guys could have went anywhere from pick 14 all the way to pick 247. It didn't matter. They were just guys. And it really felt like you needed to either fall in love with the prospect or you really needed to have an idea on how you can utilize them if you really wanted to draft them. I mean, Brad Holmes did what we all wanted. He moved back quite a bit. He traded a lot. He traded back, traded up. He gathered a ton of draft picks. And when it was all said and done, he came away with what? I think it was 8 players. I mean, he feels like he can do something with these guys. So it's going to be interesting to kind of see what happens when they go forward and when they get into the season. I found this draft to be probably more interesting than most just because of how far off, not just myself, not just you, not just the guys who get to do this for a living like Mel Kiper, Todd McShay, Albert Beer, Peter King. Everybody was off on where they thought guys were going and how soon guys were going to go. It was absolutely bonkers to me to see where the draft talent was going and when it was going. I thought it was a really strange draft. I thought from all the drafts that you and I have talked about on this podcast, I feel like this draft specifically was one of the weirder drafts that we've ever had to witness. I thought it was an incredibly strange one. And look, you can go back to that first round. That first round, I don't think anybody thinks a linebacker is necessarily going in the first round unless it's Ray Lewis, but I don't think anybody thinks a linebacker is going that early. And look, Jack Campbell, arguably the best linebacker in this draft, went at 18. I don't know. I have a rule. You don't necessarily take a running back in the first round. At least you don't take them early in the first round. Detroit Lions said, screw it. We're taking Jahmyr Gibbs. That's our guy. That's what we're doing. So I think Brad Holmes went out, identified guys that he specifically wanted, grabbed them, and whether the mock draft lined up with all of that or whether the overall consensus grade on certain players lined up with that, it was be damned to all of it. This is what we're doing. I do have a question for you because they just brought in a guy like David Montgomery. They brought in a guy who does a lot of what Jahmyr Gibbs does and does well in David Montgomery. Do you think this draft was a big loss for a guy like David Montgomery? Do you think Jahmyr Gibbs coming in is going to cut into his play time? I mean, look, they traded DeAndre Swift, so I'm assuming that Jahmyr Gibbs is going to get those touches that Swift was going to get. But do you think this draft hurts David Montgomery's stock with the Detroit Lions and hurts his stock going forward?
No, not at all. I think that, and I definitely want to get your sense of what happened with DeAndre Swift. I think it complements David Montgomery very well. I think it allows him to be that. And I think that's where the misunderstanding for me happened, is that Bijan Robinson, his role is filled by David Montgomery. They want him to be the guy that's at the goal line, get the tough yards, break tackles. And Jahmyr Gibbs is the guy that they line up all over the place, in the slot, in the backfield, all over the place. The new phrase that's going around is the offensive weapon, and David Montgomery is the bell cow. That, hey, it's 3rd and 1, you give him the ball. And Jahmyr Gibbs is the guy that you can toss the ball to and get that set, that those 3-4 yards in a screen situation. So I think it's a perfect complement. And when you look at it in totality, David Montgomery, Jahmyr Gibbs, you would think is better than Jamal Williams and DeAndre Swift. And I know some people are saying, well, and the argument's fair, if you gave up on Swift for a 4th rounder in 2 years, maybe you just keep him on the roster, you move on from Craig Reynolds, and if a team has an injury at running back, now you can get a 2nd rounder for him. But the problem is, I just don't think that DeAndre Swift, no matter what you try and do, is going to stay healthy enough to give you that value. I think across the league, a guy that's viewed as a rental, his productivity, his inability to stay healthy made his value a 4th-round pick. I think that's the best you could get. Maybe you could get a 3rd-round pick, but you would, in essence, I think the information that people didn't have is that I'm sure once Gibbs was drafted, that Swift and his team said, okay, we want out. Just please, not angrily, but hey, we understand what's going on. We're not seeing the opportunity for another year, another contract, so please do us a solid. And with the draft, I think it's the same situation. There's information that a lot of pundits don't know in terms of the psychological evals. And Brad Holmes said it, and I think it doesn't shit on the mock drafts or the draft evals. It gives you a sense of who teams could be interested in or who could be fits. But I just think that teams, it's a full, there's a psychological profile and there's a scheme fit and there's coaches too. Maybe Scotty Montgomery said, I love this player, along with Ben Johnson. Maybe Ben Johnson said, look, I like Bijan, and we could do this. And Scotty Montgomery is like, well, yeah, but look at this. And then Brad, there's multiple opinions. So you don't think that they debated Bijan Robinson like you and I did? And in the end, they said Jahmyr Gibbs. And that's the mistake. And I think that's the growth, is that, okay, now if I said, hey, I want a running back, I shouldn't have just targeted one. I should have said, okay, maybe there's 2 or 3. And that's good. In that you understood that, okay, the Lions could have gone offense and defense, which I said since December. I think the fairest thing that the Lions could have did was target an offensive player and a defensive player in the 1st round, and that's what they did. And for David Montgomery, he's got to be very happy he could prolong his career by not having as many touches. That's how the league is going. You just very rarely have bell cows because they get hurt.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Look, I think for David Montgomery, I think this doesn't hurt him at all, right? He was coming into a backfield where he already had DeAndre Swift. I think you bring in a guy like Jahmyr Gibbs. He's an upgraded version of DeAndre Swift. He's a guy who hopefully will stay healthier. He's a guy who I think is a little bit more explosive and can do a little bit more. I think he's also a little bit more elusive. If you go back to watching the HBO special, The Hard Knocks with the Lions, there was one episode where you had coaches getting in DeAndre Swift's face about running the right route, running the route the way that they want the route ran, and doing things correctly. And I think there was a bit of an issue there. I think there was a bit of an impasse. I feel like DeAndre Swift kind of wanted to do things his own way sometimes, and he would shy away from contact and he would run away from it. And there were times where they're like, no, we need you to get up the hole because that's how the play is designed. If you go up the hole, it's going to open up for you. You got to trust it. I think that was part of an issue that was not really touched on. I feel like that was an issue that was kind of glossed over. Then you add in the fact that DeAndre Swift can't ever stay healthy. It's another problem for this team because if you're not available and you're one of our featured players, we've got specific design plays for you, and you can't go out there and run them. Now they've got to default to Craig Reynolds. And look, there's a step down. As good as Craig Reynolds is, no disrespect to him, he is what he is. This is a guy who comes in and basically spells a guy for a breath. He's not out there to be a stud running back for you. But I think bringing in a guy like Jahmyr Gibbs, it helps David Montgomery. I think, like you said, it takes less off his plate, less touches. I think the team upgrades more because I think Jahmyr Gibbs will be a better player than DeAndre Swift is. I think in the end, David Montgomery is going to just really have to go out there and focus on doing what he does best. I think Jahmyr Gibbs is going to be put in a position where he is going to be used like a weapon. Look at it this way. David Montgomery is basically going to be your dagger, right? He's going to be basically death by 1,000 touches. And he's going to cut you up, and he's going to get loose, and he's going to get away from you, and then you're going to tackle him 20 yards downfield. That's what he's going to do. Jahmyr Gibbs is basically going to be a katana. He's going to be one slice, your head's coming off. He's going to be a guy, you get him out on a bubble screen, next thing you know, he's 80 yards down the field. Good luck catching him. And that's how this offense is going to run with these two running backs. I think it's going to work out best that way. Like, I don't think this hurts David Montgomery's production at all. I think this works out actually really well for him because he doesn't have to do as much anymore. So it's going to be interesting to kind of see how this all works out. Was Jahmyr Gibbs your favorite player? I know that you were beating your chest quite a bit because you had been talking about running back for a long time. I told you were crazy, and next thing you know, it's running back. It's not the guy who you said it was, but it was a running back, and it was a running back that they took early. Was that your favorite draft pick by Brad Holmes?
I love home run threats on offense. I think it helps Jared Goff. No, I think my favorite pick is Jack Campbell. I think that he's going to be a killer. I think that he is going to look. The dude is a big boy. Like, he's a tight end. That is a big boy. Now, I can't wait to see his closing speed and how he does. But I just like, wow, that is a 6'5", 240-pound dude that could potentially in 5 years wreck people. And that's what you want in a linebacker. When his college coach says this is a Ray Lewis type leader, and he comes in and he's like, I'm not on social media. My hobby is to hunt, hang out with my family, and win games. I'm like, oh my God, this dude is serious. And the whole media room was like, does this guy like want to have fun? No, this is a guy that wants to play football, wants to hurt people, wants to play linebacker, and is going to develop and literally live in the facility. That's the guy. Now, can it translate to the field? It's going to take time, but know the name Jack Campbell. I think you found your green dot linebacker. I think you found your captain. And learning from Anceloni, learning from Calvin Shepard, learning from the likes of Chris Spielman, guys, get ready. You might have something here where you're like, oh my goodness, this dude is going to anchor a defense for the next decade. So Jack Campbell does it for me. I'm curious to see how Sam Laporta does. Does he make some of the plays, or is he kind of a player that goes by the wayside like Hawkinson? I'm curious. They went back to Iowa because Hawkinson didn't work out. But, hey, Sam Laporta also 1A, 1B. Also, the third best is the power ranking is Brian Branch. I just think his first year is going to be designated for special teams and learning. So, guys.
Oh, no way, dude. I think the Brian Branch pick. Yeah, I think the Brian Branch pick was a stud selection. I thought that was great. Look, I think what you have there is you've got a guy in C.J. Gardner-Johnson that Brian Branch is going to learn under. He's going to sit underneath that learning tree, and they're going to be like, look, watch what he does. Everything he does, we want you to emulate it. That is your spot next season, that you are going to take over for him. I expect Brian Branch to get in on some rotational downs too. He's too versatile to just be a special teams player this year. I think he will be on special teams, but he is way too versatile of a player to not be out on the field, to not be out there making impact. I think he is going to essentially be your C.J. Gardner-Johnson clone. He's the guy that they're like, look, we got him. We really like him. That's your spot. So go earn your spot. Sit underneath his learning tree, and that way you can take over. And we both know that defensive backs usually take a year to kind of evolve and mature. So I think this works out perfect for him. I think he gets to basically learn from the guy who he is supposed to essentially be. And this guy is going to be another guy who's going to be a weapon on defense, right? You can line him up over the slot. You can line him up as a nickel, as a dime. You can line him up as a safety. He could be a free safety. He could be a strong safety. You could put him anywhere on the field, and you're gonna get production from him. Really, he was probably my favorite draft pick out of everything Brad Holmes did. He was, just because of where he was taken and what he can do on the defensive side of the ball. And look, I love Jack Campbell. I think Jack Campbell is going to be an absolute stud. But if you're talking about strictly value, and you're talking about what they can do on the field, I think for me, it was Brian Branch coming into this team because, again, I thought where they got him was incredible, and I thought what he can do, the way he can help transform and camouflage your defense, I think it's going to be awesome. I think it's going to be fantastic. What draft pick had you scratching your head the most? Because I've got a couple.
Well, Broderick Martin trading 3 picks for him, I mean, that's a lot, but it kind of works in regards to capital and stuff like that to kind of move away. It made our day 3 much easier to only have 2 picks, but that's when you trade 3 picks for a guy, I think you could have got a similar type player without having to give up that many resources, but in the way in which the roster shook out and how you wanted to do it, it's weird to give up that much capital for a one-dimensional kind of guy, but, it's just interesting that they look to, the one that left everybody scratching their head, and to give you guys a little bit of insight, you get to the later rounds, and I think it's the 5th round, and they go, Colby Sorsdale, and everybody's like, huh? And ESPN,
the tackle out of Williams and Mary.
I think ESPN just blew by him. We have in our system, when you guys see the links at All Lions, we have a system that utilizes photos from nationally recognized photographers. There's not a single photo of Colby in that system, and it has hundreds of thousands of photos. Not one. And everybody was like, huh? We all had to look at, who the hell is this guy? And, obviously, William and Mary. So that one left everybody scratching their head because you read the previews. I think he was the 53rd ranked lineman in the Athletics preview. So that's digging deep for a lineman. But the dude is strong and has the wherewithal to fit what the Lions are looking for. But my God, Colby Sorsdal was the pick that left everybody going, what? Huh? ESPN's like, Lions pick Colby Sorsdal. Next, okay, let's talk. And that was funny because everybody caught up on that quickly.
Yeah, I was like, who is this guy? Where is he from? You couldn't have got a different tackle that, maybe comes from a bit of a better lineage, maybe a little bit more prestige, but it's what it is. Again, these guys in this front office drafted guys that they deemed worthy. I think, to me, probably the most head-scratching draft pick, and we had talked about him, and look, I'm a fan of him. It's just where he was taken and kind of what they've done, right? It was Hendon Hooker. Hendon Hooker, I look, he would be a first-round draft pick if he didn't get hurt. He would have probably been the 3rd quarterback taken. All that being said, for the Detroit Lions, I don't necessarily know if taking him in the 3rd round where they took him made the most sense, because you could have got a guy who could have been on the field helping you out. And instead, you've got a guy who's now rehabbing from an ACL injury, and he's going to be a backup quarterback for you if he's healthy enough to even play. And that's kind of my issue with the Hendon Hooker pick, man. After that, it was trading up for the defensive tackle. I just didn't understand giving up all of that to go get that guy specifically, and especially since there was a guy like Saka Ika who was there that you could have grabbed, and he's another big, large body that's going to be there to clog the middle. So just a bit of a head scratcher with what they did in that 3rd round. But for me, Hendon Hooker, I just didn't. I don't know. Was the selection of Hendon Hooker? Was that like, okay, I get it and I'm okay with that? Or were you kind of like, I don't know, guys, maybe you'll get a player who's going to contribute on the field, somebody who can at least be a rotational player for you? I don't know, maybe grab a D-end, somebody? Was that more you, or were you more like, all right, I get it, let's go?
No, it kind of gives me a sense of how the organization operates a little bit. They are okay redshirting players. They are okay. The guy's 25, about to be 26 years old, and he's not going to see the field all that much this year. So what that tells me is that the Lions have a plan, and if it bucks convention, many people would say, okay, go get the guy that's going to push Jared Goff. They don't want to do that. They wanted to get a guy, and relationships matter to the Lions. They wanted to get a guy that Brad Holmes had familiarity with, and what it shows you is that when the Lions do their eval, it's specific, it's targeted towards leaders, it's targeted towards a lot of things. And Brad Holmes has said this. It's not secret. Football IQ, leadership, no turds, and individuals that will have the capability of being able to step in and do what the coaching staff is asking. And they're not afraid of injured players. They're not afraid of individuals that, a 25-year-old backup and who's going to be QB3, guys. He's not going to be thrown into the fire. He is a developmental quarterback that won't see the field until he's 27 minimum. And if Jared Goff goes down, it's not going to be Hendon Hooker thrown out there. He's got to learn Ben Johnson's offense. He's got to learn the NFL life. But who better to learn from than Jared Goff and Nate Sudfeld? So the organization is not taking a traditional linear approach to what they need. Brad Holmes said, we need to upgrade the quarterback position. You and I might have gone different in terms of a veteran. They tried with Teddy Bridgewater. Bridgewater may still come in and be that guy because then you could have that competition with Sudfeld, which is always great in a locker room. But bottom line, QB1 is Goff. QB2 right now is Sudfeld. QB3 is Hendon Hooker, and that's the way it is. And don't sleep on Adrian Martinez, who is going to be a solid developmental quarterback on the practice squad. But guys, pay attention to Mo Ibrahim too. Everybody's looking at.
I thought that was
yes, that was bomb, dude. That was awesome. And so the undrafted free agents also, so what it tells me about this organization when I look at Hendon Hooker and the draft in total, they have their plan. It involves deep analysis over the course of 10 months, and they love SEC-type players and gritty players. So obviously Alabama, Georgia, Iowa, Northwestern, Big Ten stuff, that's where they're targeting players. It teaches you a lot, and it's very fair to recognize what is going on with the Lions, and it's almost now going to be a little bit more interesting, hopefully next year, where they only have a pick 1 in the 20s. 2 picks the last 2 years is draining, and it's a lot of stuff to cover. But hopefully the Lions now win 10, 11 games, and they can go back to being a little bit more traditional and drafting 1 pick in every round and maneuvering maybe. Guys, what's next is Brad Holmes is no different than Les Snead. The next step is you build through the draft, and then you use those picks to target 1 or 2 guys that are impactful. Get ready. 2nd and 3rd round picks are going to start to go away. Remember, you build through the draft. You now have 20 players that potentially are going to be the core through free agency and the draft. Now you can use your extra 4th rounder and package it with the 2nd in the future and maybe go up and get that impactful wide receiver that you need or that impactful defensive tackle. It's about that time. One or 2 more years, and fuck them picks is going to start to show in this Lions organization. Just wait and see. But by and large, it's a B draft. I'm very happy with it. I think that it's going to turn out to be very fruitful for the Lions. And I just think that when you see players like DeAndre Swift who don't cut it, they're gone. He basically wiped out Bob Quinn's 2020 draft, rightfully so.
Yeah. Were you shocked that that Mohamed Ibrahim ended up getting a signing bonus?
Nope.
I thought that was weird. Undrafted free agent. They're going to lace him with, I think it was like $100,000 signing bonus. And look, I thought it was great. Anything to do to get the guy in the room.
Yeah, and they did it last year with the wide receiver. So it's not a guarantee he makes a team, but that's a nice chunk of change for these UDFAs. I kind of like what the league might do is they might just extend the draft 1 more round to 8 rounds, and that way you can cut out maybe, from 13 undrafted free agents down to maybe 5. But we'll see what happens. But I love it. I love that they target good players that they believe. And look, the talent management is not now going to be one of those things where you can really, say is a weakness. Now we got to see who starts to play well among this draft class and how it fits. You got to win. You basically got to win this year. And that's what in essence, I love what the Sporting News and how a lot of the analysts that looked at it and said, oh, this draft represents win now. Jahmyr Gibbs is win now. Jack Campbell, win now. And you look at it and you say, you know what? That makes sense. The top 4 are going to contribute. So let's see what happens. And judging now by how the Packers and Bears did, I think the Lions had one of the best drafts in the NFC North. So it's a good time, man. It's a good time to be a Lions fan. You can debate and speculate and all that kind of stuff, but it's a great time to be a Lions fan because when players don't perform, they move on. And the Lions are running it in a way that leads you to believe that Brad Holmes understands his position, understands how to put together a draft, and all those trades, all those relationships now he's built. He didn't get fleeced in any of those deals. He got good value based on the trade charts, and he moved back, moved up. The one that, like I said, Broderick Martin to trade 3 picks for is interesting, but you can't have 11 picks in this draft. So you needed to do what you need to do to get the roster to 90. So let's see what happens. But overall, a B draft after what you've done the first 2 years, I still think Brad Holmes is one of the top GMs.
Yeah, I think so too. And look, if you're a Lions fan, what you're looking forward to next is you've got the schedule release coming out.
Yep.
I believe it's next week. So your team is essentially set. You know that you've got some dogs, you've got some studs. It'll be interesting to see how these rookies kind of transition through OTAs and then kind of where the depth chart leaves you. I think for me specifically, I am looking at not so much where these rookies go, but where a lot of these undrafted rookies go. Where the wide receivers, they ended up grabbing 2 wide receivers that were undrafted draft picks. I'm looking to see if those guys make the teams or if they contribute in any way. And then I'm looking to see what happens with Mohamed Ibrahim. Like, that's a guy who I really liked. That was a guy who I thought that if they wanted to grab a running back, they wanted to do it later in the draft, that's a guy they could have got later. I love the fact that they were able to not spend a draft pick on him, still get him in here. And I like the fact that they gave him a little bit of cash. And I think he makes the team. I think it's going to be interesting to see kind of what happens on that side of the ball. I wish they would have got some more high-profile players on the defensive side of the ball. But again, I think Brad Holmes really likes what he's got going on with that defense. And I think he likes what he's got going on with that defensive front. There are still free agents out there, still guys that they could either bring in on a 1-year contract, because Brad Holmes loves those, or guys that they can give a multi-year contract to. There are still dudes out there that they can bring in and could really help bolster that defensive line, but we're just going to have to kind of wait and see.
Awesome stuff. Make sure you follow Adam on Twitter at AdamRSTROZ. Follow the network at Detroit Podcast. Great audio content. Anywhere that you listen to podcasts or audio broadcasts, make sure you type in Detroit Sports Podcast, and our content will find you. Cuz great recording. Look forward to hearing how you thought and broke down the draft. It's very reasonable, very much in line with how a lot of people that looked at the draft are exploring it and debating it. I can't wait to see it. Minicamp's going to start in a couple weeks, so you'll get a chance to listen further, some more insights, some inside information regarding what these rookies are bringing to the table. So make sure you follow us on Twitter at Detroit Podcast, uncensored, unfiltered, dedicated to Detroit sports. DSP, you know it, Detroit Sports Podcast, bringing you quality Detroit sports podcasts each and every week. Cuz I can't wait for next week to record the latest and greatest edition of Doc and Jock.